This video is titled Einstein in the Election of 2012. Now, I just made a video on Einstein defending him against somebody who claimed that his relativity was all false and that, it was all a big lie and everything. And I want to go further than that because I don't want to talk about Einstein the physicist. I want to talk about Einstein the troublemaker. I want to talk about Einstein the radical. I want to talk about Einstein the dissenter. The Einstein who was kicked out of Nazi Germany because this Einstein was a universalist. He was an internationalist, whereas the Nazis were very blatantly against the heritage of Western universalism, of internationalism. You know, what is universalism? The founding charter of my country, and again, this is going to be about the election of 2012 or a few days before it, so I'll comment on it. The founding charter of my country states all men are created equal. That your rights are not your rights are not something that are defined socially, but they're something that are yours at birth. That is universalism. And you know, the Declaration of Independence is dangerous. So dangerous that the ruling class needs to keep it encased in the National Archives, encased in Washington, D.C., because its actual effect on the world was, the French Revolution, which definitely went to an excess, and I would not defend its excesses. I would not defend, I'm not a believer that I think the head should be attached to the body, okay? But the idea of equality, the idea of that there is no one born to rule over. And then that went further with the various worker movements in the 19th century and the various movements for greater justice for oppressed peoples, anti-colonial movements. So that's a dangerous idea that went far beyond its bourgeois origins among the founding fathers. Much further than the founding fathers themselves, who did own slaves and in some cases did trade them. What they bequeathed to us was something greater than themselves. And this is dangerous. And the same thing could be said for the image of Einstein. It's non-threatening. It's iconic. But the actual Einstein was a radical. The actual Einstein favored civil rights. And so, if Einstein were alive today, I don't have the right to say that. But I am. And the reason that I am going to go a little bit further than what it's my right to say is because we're living in a time of great emergency. And I think that in a time of great emergency, Einstein's memory has to be kept alive. His memory has to be not just the memory of Einstein the physicist, the non-threatening Einstein, but the Einstein of troublemaking, the Einstein of universalism. And so here goes. If Einstein were alive today, his commitment to universalism, his commitment to the heritage that is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, which is a radical heritage. It is not conservative. It is radical. All men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, means that your rights are not defined by your national origin or your race. They are not defined by your economic status. If Einstein were alive today, he would be against the disenfranchisement of voters in Florida, in Ohio. He would be against the random stoppings of African-American men in New York. He would be against Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County in Arizona. How do I know this? I know this because he got onto J. Edgar Hoover's radar screen. You see, he was forced out of Nazi Germany for being a universalist, but he got into trouble here for the same reason during the McCarthy era. You see, in the case of the Nazis, they were very, very honest. There was no hypocrisy there. They said they wanted tyranny and enslavement, and they delivered. And that was different than the communists, who were hypocritical. They say they believed. If the average true believing communist is more in favor of, the idea that all men are created equal than you or me put together. Because, they took it to the point where a truth became the truth, and that's fanaticism. But obviously, the actual working out of the communist system was a tyranny and enslavement. So there was hypocrisy. So it's kind of like everybody has to be absolutely equal, with no chance for for any kind of market system, and that's fanaticism. I mean, I believe in a mixed system. I would say Einstein would too. But at the very same time in the communist system, you had a ruthless oligarchy in practice. But the Nazis were very, very honest. They believed in a ruthless oligarchy, and then they delivered. Here in the United States, we have, you know, somewhere in that respect, maybe we're more like the communists in the way that we have these great ideas, but they're not put into practice. And when you try to put them into practice, you get beaten. You get beaten up by the police. If you try to protest for them, I mean, look what happened to the Occupy movement. Look what happened to the civil rights movement until it ultimately triumphed. Well, today you can be in favor of civil rights, and that's okay. I mean, we have an African-American president, and that's very much of something that the country accepts. But if you start talking about economic equality, people get very, very nervous. Now, I'm not talking about, again, a rigid kind of equality, such as under Marxism, but what I am talking about is definitely more equality than we have now, where the bankers and the CEOs and the military-industrial complex and the Hollywood magnates and the sports heroes, all these people earn all this money, and together it's a whole lot of our gross national product, and that's bad for the economy. It's not just morally wrong, it's actually bad for our economy. If Einstein were alive today, he would be speaking out against these things. I believe if Einstein were alive today, he'd be in favor of the Occupy movement. Not the radicals, per se, but, you know, I guess they're all radicals according to the dominant consensus of the corporate media. If Einstein were alive today, he would be very critical of war as a de facto instrument of foreign policy. Now, he was very much of a liberal Zionist, as am I. He would defend the right of Israel to exist, as do I. In his day, the critics of Israel were predominantly on the right. Today, they tend very, very much to be from the left. But in both cases, I think that there's a strong blindness. And you know, I would say that Einstein would speak out about that. But he would also speak out against continual wars, whether they be in the Middle East or whether they be elsewhere in the world. Again, he was not a pure pacifist, nor am I. But he did believe very much that the world needed to move beyond war as a de facto instrument of foreign policy. We'll leave the Iran issue aside because that's a dangerous theocracy and that's a whole other question. But come on, Libya, Iraq, Gulf War I, Panama, the destabilization campaign against Hugo Chavez. I mean, these things are not wars in favor of the existential survival of the U.S. or Israel or our allies. I mean, these are engagements for war. These are motivated by profit. Let's call it what it is. And I think if Einstein were alive today, he would be speaking out. Now, was Einstein a pure left-wing radical? I would say that he was very much of a libertarian socialist, maybe like Noam Chomsky. And I think that there would be some of the libertarian shining through. I'm sure, like I am, he'd be in favor of the right to bear arms. I mean, the idea of the people being enfranchised and able to defend themselves. I mean, I think that he wouldn't be a pure left-winger. But I think that Einstein was against the idea of institutionalized violence, particularly at the state level. I mean, he was always against nationalistic kind of warmongering when he was growing up. He didn't like the public school system precisely because the Prussian school system was imbued with that. Finally, I think if Einstein were alive today, he would probably want an independent investigation of 9/11 or of JFK. Now, I'm not going to endorse all the conspiracy theories and the like, but I think he probably would at least not want the executive branch investigating itself. But finally, at long last, if Einstein were alive today, he would want you to vote reason. Not fear, not hatred of the other, but reason. And he probably would want a few third parties out there too, but that's neither here nor there. CHistrue.